Herzlich willkommen bei UNZENSIERT, der politischen Gesprächsreihe hier beim Filmfest Hamburg mit freundlicher Unterstützung der Zeitstiftung. Heute ist Donal Foreman bei mir. Welcome, nice to have you here.
Good to be here.
He is an Irish filmmaker. I think he came here from New York. And where he's actually living. And yeah, we will talk about his second feature film, which is called The Image You Missed. And well, it's kind of an autobiographical essay that explores your father, the American and Irish documentary filmmaker Arthur McCaig, and his lifelong effort to cover the Northern Ireland conflict. As well, and that's the second part you're exploring, your relationship with him. So please let us know, what was the starting point for you to make this movie?
Well, the starting point was really in the months following my father's death. I was able to go into his apartment in Paris where he'd been living and sort through his belongings. And I didn't really know him when he was alive. I met him only a handful of times. I grew up with my mother in Dublin. So going into his apartment after his death was really the first moment that I sort of discovered his world and discovered his archive, because in his apartment there was thousands of photos, film reels, tapes, that just every closet you opened there was more and more images and film material. And so that experience was really the starting point. And it was several years later before I really formulated the approach of how I would tackle the film. But I kept referring back to that experience because I thought of trying to translate into the film that experience of sorting through his archive and sorting through the archive of someone you feel connected to, a kind of relationship to, even though you don't know them.
I imagine it to be so difficult. I mean, you only met him a few times, and then you're there in his apartment, and how do you approach and so many tapes and photographs and everything, and as well as personal feelings to it? How did you make a plan? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why it, took so long to really get started on it in a way, because it's now almost exactly 10 years since he died, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago I kind of worked out a plan. And I think that was the key thing, was working out what were the kind of the questions that I was interested in exploring through his material. That I wasn't trying to tell the whole story of who he was, and I tried to approach it that, what would be interesting about this film, even if I didn't have this relationship to him? What are the bigger questions that it's touching upon? So that kind of structured my approach. So, I mean, I spent half a year watching everything that was in the archive, but I was always seeing what resonated with my questions or not.
what were like the main feelings that came up for you?
That's a hard one to describe. I think it's something, I don't know, it's a very uncanny experience. I think of it as, it's like living in a haunted house or something, I think
Ooh.
It's, at times it got to feel a little morbid, because you're just living in the images of this person who's dead, and a lot of the images I'm seeing are people who are now dead, and people who I don't know. So yeah.
You heard his voice as well?
Yeah, well, that was another interesting challenge. Was he had almost no directly personal material in his archive. There was no home movies. He never kept a journal. There was very little reflection on himself. All of the material was looking outwards. So even, there was thousands and thousands of photos, but they were almost always of people he didn't even know. Traveling around, he just photographed people on the street. So they weren't really the people in his life even a lot of the time. So I had to kind of look for him in the margins of the material in a way. Sometimes you just see him glimpsed in the mirror at the end of a shot, or you'd hear him talking to someone on screen, and you kind of find these little traces.
Wow. I picked it to be pretty hard work for half a year to face all this material of your father. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you experienced his work then. I mean, he made over, I think, 8 movies over the course of 30 years.
And like 8 features, I think.
8 features,
short films. Yeah. Or, well, 8 films in Northern Ireland specifically. And then he also made several films about the Basque conflict and different political issues.
And later on for TV as well. So he was very ambitious and very much involved in the conflict in Northern Ireland. So what would you say was his approach, or what was driving him to do this?
Well, he said that it was visiting Northern Ireland in the early 70s that motivated him to become a filmmaker, because he saw such a discrepancy between what he had heard in the media about the conflict and what he experienced on the ground. In the kind of mainstream narrative about it at the time was that it was a primarily religious, tribal conflict between communities in the north. And what he saw was something that was much more of a class conflict and a colonial conflict. And so after that, he went to film school in Paris, and his graduate film from college was his first feature about the North, The Patriot Game. So it really was the kind of foundation of his film career, was his relationship with that struggle in particular.
You said that, I just like to quote you because I'd like that, what you said. One decision I made early on is that I wanted to go back to the raw footage of his films as much as possible. I think I left none of this original edits in my movie. So why did you decide to do that?
Because I wanted to make my own interpretation of the material and really kind of twist it to my own purposes, frankly. One of the motivations for me was a lot of the films I've made before have been fiction, drama, and I've always been interested in engaging with politics through film, and I've written a lot about that as a critic, but I hadn't quite found a way for it to manifest substantially in my own films. And I saw the opportunity of using my father's archive as a way to kind of push myself in that direction, and also push myself formally in new directions, using a kind of essay film form that I hadn't used before. So it was this kind of raw material, and it was like kind of the idea of absorbing his work into my own to transform myself as a filmmaker. And so it just became necessary and more interesting to go back to the original footage. Part of it was, I thought it was more interesting to show things that hadn't been shown before. A lot of the footage has never been seen before. And in his films, the editing tends to be quite quick, especially later when it's stuff that's made for TV. And so by going back to the raw footage, I could kind of see things that he saw but chose not to include it, or perhaps, find things that he may not have found interesting, but I found interesting in the material, and make connections that he wouldn't have made. So, yeah, that's why it was necessary.
Were you kind of discussing this with him of some sort?
I mean, I thought of the film as a dialogue, as a kind of ghostly dialogue from earlier on. In the credits of the film, it says a film between the two of us. So yeah, there's definitely an element of that.
Could you sometimes feel, oh, he wouldn't like that, and I'll do it anyway? I mean, in a way, it's like I never knew him well enough to know what he would
like or not. But I can't say that I really thought of that. I mean, I feel like he'd probably just be happy for the attention, you know? And it's going to bring more people back to his films as well. But I know it's, you know, it's a kind of film that is, it's the opposite of his films in a lot of ways, because his documentaries were very kind of straight, didactic kind of approaches to a situation that wanted to explain very clearly, this is the situation, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, this is what needs to be done, and give a very kind of holistic picture in that way. And also, he did that in a way that excluded his own position. You never have a sense of, well, who is this American in Ireland making this film? Why is he doing this? What's his relationship with his people? That's just totally left out of the picture. And those kind of questions of like the relationship between the filmmaker and the subject were things that I was really interested in bringing into the frame.
Could you answer that for yourself then, after all these years of working through stuff?
Answer what?
Like what he was really into, what was driving him in the end? I mean, you explained to us why he started in the beginning, but he's at some point he seemed to be quite, not obsessed, but really, I mean, he always needed to go back. He always needed to film more.
Yeah, it's.
He left you for doing that too.
Well, he was never really around. He was never really there to leave in the first place. Yeah, I think that's a complex one. I think there's an element. I mean, he kind of came of age in the 60s and 70s in a very kind of radical revolutionary period, and was part of kind of very leftist socialist circles. So those were his politics, and I think part of it was a genuine political solidarity with this cause. He was Irish American. He grew up in an Irish American community, so I think there was also a sense of his identity being linked there. And then I think also if you look, I mean, one of the reasons as well I wanted to go back to his raw footage and look at what he was filming was I think you can see that there's also something more primal or libidinal in what he's attracted to. And you see in his films, there's a lot of images of masked men, IRA men wandering around with guns. There's a lot of images of children playing. And these images are used in a way in excess of their function, of their like illustrative function in the kind of documentary narrative. They're also, it's like they're just something he's really attracted to and aesthetically or emotionally drawn to, like it excites him. So I think that's definitely a factor as well. There's a romanticism there tied in with a real political solidarity.
You said earlier as well that you never had this political approach as he had, and in the movie you're talking about how you try to, for example, film the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then you kind of stopped and had this feeling like, man, there are too many pictures out there anyway. And I wondered if you ever envied your father for maybe different times he lived in, where you could still have new pictures or more of them. Or
yeah, I think that, I mean, that is kind of a big question in the film, as well as the difference between us as filmmakers or as people. There's this generational difference, and I think there is something to be envied about, like a period where there was more of a sense of these images are missing and these images are needed. But I don't think, even then, I don't think I could have made the same films, the same kind of films that he was making, because, I mean, I think even to the, I've had some screenings of the film where people have kind of questioned this generational comparison I've made and say, well, actually, there's still revolutionary things going on. There's still armed struggles happening. You know, if I wanted, I could go film the Kurds in Rojava and film these, like, you know, these current kind of socialist leftist things, and which aren't actually being represented as much as they could be. But I can't imagine myself doing that because of my own kind of constant self-questioning or doubt. I would just have so many problems with what I was doing as I was doing it. I think perhaps one difference for him, because I think if you're a filmmaker, if you go to another country to kind of, you know, make films about their politics, there's a lot of complicated ethical stuff you come into, and who are you to kind of tell their story and all these questions. And I think maybe he circumvented that partly because of his identity kind of brought him into, his Irish American identity brought him into that place. Yeah.
But you're too.
Hmm?
But you're born and raised in Dublin, aren't you?
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of, you know, if I went to Kurdistan, it's not the same. It's not the same dynamic.
There's a very strong scene, I think, in your movie where, I mean, you started very young as a filmmaker, in the age of 11,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I like that you cut a lot of your own material against kind of the material of your father. And I especially like this shot where you filmed, I think it was a friend or it was even yourself, a young boy coming out of a cupboard, a lot of artificial blood all over his face and jumper, and just falling out of the cupboard and pretending to be hurt. And then you cut that to an image your father took of a man actually coming out of a house being covered in blood because he was in a real conflict on the street, going out on the street shouting. And I felt that this was so strong because it was not only looking for roots, it was something more. Maybe you can you can tell me what was it for you that you choose to cut it like that.
Well, one of the first kind of edits I envisioned for the film very early on was a similar cut that's also in the film, where I cut from some footage I shot as a kid of one of my friends wearing a mask, wearing like a Friday the 13th hockey mask, and holding a kind of fake Kalashnikov, and, you know, running into a room and holding someone up. And I cut between that and footage my father shot of real masked paramilitary men holding real Kalashnikovs. And that contrast, I mean, in a way it's just, you know, it's a quite like obvious, instinctive, like these things are similar. If I put them side by side, what does that happen? But I kind of, throughout the editing, I embraced a lot of direct visual links like that, because I feel like, yeah, it just got me thinking on a lot of questions. Part of it is the question of theatricality, because as well, what I was saying about my father's romanticism is you can see in the way that he films these soldiers, these guys in the IRA, that it's a very theatrical situation. It's staged for the camera. He's like, you know, especially when you see the unedited footage, it's clear he's made an appointment to follow them on a kind of fake patrol around the neighborhood. And sometimes they pose for the camera, and sometimes they say cut. And so there's already an element of fiction. There's an element of theatricality in there, and also those men who are in the IRA. Some of them are teenagers. Some of them are just, you know, I mean, it's serious, it's dangerous, but they're also playing, they're also posing. There's this kind of like theater of masculinity and this macho posturing that's going on. and so it links in quite a real way to what I was doing, with my friends, even though ours was like a much more ridiculous version of it.
How was it for you to go through your old stuff then? Because, I mean, was it difficult to see you as a teenager? There are a few pictures where you kind of pose in front of the camera, or you don't seem happy at all. Do you make peace with you somehow as well, or was it just funny?
Yeah, I didn't mind. I think, it's one thing I generally experience with filmmaking is I find it's a way that it's a strange way to create distance with yourself and get closer to yourself at the same time, because once you film something, you put a camera between you and the event, and that gives you a certain distance, but it also gives you a different kind of access. Sometimes you can get closer to something because of that. And when you're editing a film, it becomes abstract in a way. I'm watching images of myself or other people, and it ceases to become personal in a way, because it just becomes images. You're just trying to find, because I get asked what was, it must have been very personally, emotionally difficult to make the film, but often the most emotionally difficult things were editing decisions. Like, how do I cut from this image to that image? How will I get that cut to work? Those are the things that, kept me up at night, despairing. So the process does kind of create that distance, but then you're also spending more time and getting more deeply into these personal questions than you ever would otherwise. So it's kind of the paradox.
One might say you make such a movie to try to get something off your chest, so you can get rid of it, and it's gone in the end. Does it work that way?
I don't think so, because here I am talking about it, so it's still, it's still around. No, I think it's more. Well, no, I feel I used to be drawn to the idea of film as like an exorcism, as in The Exorcist. Like, you're kind of getting rid of these demons, and then you're free of them. But I don't think it works like that. I think it's more like making something tangible, that was just like a feeling, or was just a sort of I had a lot of thoughts or questions or feelings, and now they're in the film, and they exist in a concrete way that does, I suppose that lifts a certain burden, but it's also like you create a ghost, and then you travel around with the ghost and say, hey, look at my ghost.
So the ghost in this case might be like a picture of your father then.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow you now can finally spend time with him.
Yeah, that was also really part of it, was just I had a lot of curiosity about him. This was a way to kind of get to know him in like a posthumous sense.
Do you like him?
Huh?
Do you like him?
I don't know. I like some of his films. Yeah, it's funny. I haven't been asked that before. I haven't thought about it like that, because I still feel like I don't know him. That it's like an unknowable thing. It's like, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I think I respect him as a filmmaker, not as a father, not entirely as a person, but yeah, that's how it is.
Mm. When you're traveling with your movie, what do people react on most? You have these two parts, him as a filmmaker, his legacy, then your personal story in it, and as well the exploration of two filmmakers who are pretty different. So
it's different everywhere I go. Sometimes it's, all personal questions or more political or more filmmaking. There's kind of those three layers at once that people can tend to gravitate more towards one or the other. So it depends. I showed it in Belfast in Northern Ireland over the summer for the first time, and it was one of the only screenings. There was no political questions. No one asked about it.
In Belfast, really?
Yeah. I was surprised. I thought people would have like all kinds of objections, or why did you show it like this? But didn't come up.
I mean, in the end, it's quite a personal conflict as well, isn't it? What people are living through in Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Is your mother still living in Dublin?
Yeah, she lives in Dublin.
How did she like the movie?
She likes it. She's been very supportive of it. I mean, she really deserves a producer credit for all the kind of work she did. She was also, she provided some additional archive stuff for the film, and her voice is in the film, reading a letter. So she was supportive of it. When it screened in Dublin for the first time, she did a lot of work getting people to come to the screening, and probably half the audience was friends of hers. And then right before the screening, she had a moment of doubt and was like, oh my God, why did I get all these people to come see? She said it was like airing her dirty laundry, but
she comes along as a very kind and good mother, I think.
She's like the secret hero of the film.
I was very touched by the moment where you say, your father comes closest in the photographs you took, but there's just no photograph of you. There's only one of your mother.
Mm-hmm.
It feels so bad. I don't even have a question.
But this is the thing about kind of filmmaking at distance as well, because when I realized that, part of me is like, well, this is going to work really well in the film. This is going to be a great moment, So that's one of the saving graces of turning your life into cinema.
And is this how we should understand your title then? The image you missed? Is this image you?
That's one of the ways, but I try to get the titles to work on like a bunch of levels at once. I mean, I thought of one of the kind of the structuring concepts of the film for me was the idea of what do you put in the frame and what do you leave out. That is kind of central to filmmaking, but also applies in a metaphorical way to a lot of things. You have to set up the frame, and you're putting some things in, and you're excluding other things, and what's getting left out. What is that choice that you're making? So I thought about that a lot in the film, and I tried to, so hopefully it works on different levels.
I think it works pretty well. Your film has its Germany premiere tomorrow. Fingers crossed for that. I think you're nominated for Best Political Film for the award of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung as well. So thanks a lot for being here. Fingers crossed. All the best to you. I hope you win.
Thanks a lot.